Most of our history is hidden, not because it was erased, but because it was swallowed. At the end of the last ice age, sea levels rose and changed the world forever. Vast stretches of land disappeared beneath the waves. Coastlines moved. River valleys vanished. Entire settlements that once stood on dry ground were lost to the sea. For a long time, these stories sounded like myth. Sunken kingdoms, lost cities, ancient harbors beneath the ocean. They sounded like legends told by sailors who had been staring at the horizon for too long. But modern underwater archaeology is showing us something far more unsettling. The sea really did take entire chapters of human history. And in some places, it left behind walls, roads, foundations, pillars, and stone structures that force us to ask a difficult question. How much of the ancient world are we still missing? Today, we are diving into the forgotten past to uncover the cities the ocean tried to hide. Because the truth is, if you only look on land, you are not seeing the full story. 12,000 years ago, the Earth looked very different. Huge areas that are underwater today were once dry, habitable land. Those coastal plains were rich in resources. They had freshwater, fish, fertile soil, and access to trade routes. In other words, they were exactly the kinds of places where early civilizations would have grown. And then came the rise in sea level. Not a gentle rise, not a slow, harmless change. In some places, it was catastrophic. Glaciers melted, water rushed into the oceans. Shorelines moved inland. Settlements that had stood for generations were suddenly abandoned, buried, or flooded. Imagine living in a city your family had known for centuries and watching the sea creep closer every year. Imagine roads turning into marshland, temples becoming islands, homes disappearing under salt water. If it happened at the dawn of civilization, then much of what we call history may only be the part that survived above the waves. That is why underwater archaeology matters so much. It is not just about finding old objects. It is about finding missing civilizations. One of the most fascinating stories comes from India. The ancient city of Dwarka, pronounced Dwarka, appears in old Indian traditions as a powerful, wealthy city associated with Krishna. For centuries, many people treated it as legend, a holy story, a symbolic place. But then marine surveys and underwater research began to uncover structures off the western coast of India that raised serious questions. Stone formations, remains of ancient walls, traces of human activity beneath the sea. Some researchers argued that these findings could be connected to a very old settlement, possibly far older than people expected. Now, this site is controversial, and not every claim around it is settled. But that is exactly what makes it important. Because whether the final interpretation is legendary city, ancient harbor, or something in between, the evidence reminds us that the coastlines of the ancient world have changed dramatically. And if the coast changed, history changed with it. That means some of the oldest human stories may be sitting underwater, waiting to be rediscovered. Now let's move to Greece. Because there, beneath clear water near the coast of the Peloponnese, lies one of the most extraordinary underwater archaeological sites ever found. Pavlopetri, pronounced Pavlopetri. This is not just a scattering of stones. This is an actual city, a planned settlement with streets, courtyards, walls, rooms, and a layout that can still be traced from above. You can look down and see the shape of a place where people lived, worked, traded, and built homes thousands of years ago. Pavlopetri is often described as one of the oldest submerged cities in the world, and what makes it so powerful is not just its age. It is the clarity of what remains. Unlike a vague rumor or a single artifact, Pavlopetri gives us the outline of an entire urban environment. That means ancient people were not just wandering around in small groups. They were organizing space, planning buildings, creating infrastructure, building communities near the sea. And again, that brings us back to the same idea. If you want to understand the ancient world, you have to understand ancient coastlines. Because coastlines were where trade happened, where settlements grew, where wealth gathered, where people connected with distant places, and where rising waters could erase everything. This is why so many underwater discoveries matter. They are not isolated anomalies. They are part of a much larger pattern. Around the Mediterranean, archaeology has revealed submerged harbor systems, drowned walls, stone anchors, and port structures that show just how advanced ancient maritime life really was. The sea was not a barrier. It was a highway, and many civilizations built their futures around it. But then there are sites that become even more mysterious. Sites where people start asking whether we're looking at nature, or at construction, or at a mixture of both. One of the most famous examples is the Yonaguni Monument off the coast of Japan. Pronounced Yonaguni, this site has sparked debate for decades. It is a massive underwater rock formation with sharp edges, flat faces, step-like levels, and geometric-looking surfaces that seem strangely organized. To some researchers, it looks natural, the result of fractures, erosion, and tectonic activity. To others, it looks artificial, like a structure carved or modified by human hands. There are even features that some have interpreted as stairs, terraces, or cut marks. And whether you see it as natural or man-made, the reason it captures so much attention is simple. It challenges the assumption that ancient people were always too primitive to create large-scale, organized structures. Because if humans modified Yonaguni, then someone was working on a monumental project long ago in a region now completely underwater. That possibility changes everything. And even if the site turns out to be natural, it still reminds us of something important. The ocean hides things. A lot of things. And we have barely begun to search. Less than 5% of the world's oceans have been thoroughly explored. That means the majority of the underwater world is still a mystery. Think about that. More than 95% remains largely unknown. So when we find a few walls, a few streets, a few platforms, a few buried structures, we are only seeing the first clues, not the whole story. In fact, some of the most important discoveries may not be grand cities at all. They may be smaller clues that point to lost landscapes, ancient tools, harbor remains, drowned road networks, stone anchors, pottery fragments, carved blocks. Every one of these is a breadcrumb. Every one of them says the same thing. People were here, and the land they lived on is gone. This is where the subject becomes bigger than archaeology. It becomes a question of memory. How many myths about sunken lands are actually memories of real events? How many flood stories were passed down because people truly watched their homes disappear beneath rising water? How many legends of lost kingdoms began with something real? A coastline flooding, a temple collapsing into the sea, a settlement abandoned forever. When people survived those events, they remembered them. And sometimes those memories survived for thousands of years in story form. That is why flood myths appear in so many cultures. Not because every myth is literal history, but because rising water was one of the most powerful forces ancient people ever faced. It could take everything. The old version of history often makes the ancient world seem smaller, simpler, and less connected than it really was. But underwater discoveries tell a different story. They tell us ancient people built complex communities near the sea. They navigated. They traded. They planned. They adapted. They may have lived in places that are now inaccessible except to divers, sonar systems, and marine archaeologists. And if that is true, then the lost coastal world may have been far more advanced than we usually imagine. Not science fiction, not fantasy, just forgotten. That is what makes the sea so important. It is not only a destroyer, it is also a preservation chamber. In some places, salt water, sediment, and darkness can protect remains for thousands of years. Wood, stone, road patterns, even entire landscapes. So while the ocean takes away access, it can also preserve evidence of what used to be there. And when that evidence finally appears, it can force us to rewrite the map. That is why underwater archaeology feels so different from ordinary history. It is history with missing pieces, history with the edges torn off, history waiting to be recovered. And once you start looking beneath the waves, you begin to see just how much has been lost. A city in Greece, a mysterious site in Japan, possible ancient harbor systems in the Mediterranean, traditional stories from India that may preserve memories of flooded land. Each one is different, but together they point to the same deeper truth. The ancient world was not a neat line of progress. It was a world of expansion, collapse, adaptation, and survival. Some civilizations rose on land, some along coasts, some disappeared into the sea before we ever learned their names. So when we talk about the forgotten past, we are not only talking about temples, kings, or stone monuments. We're talking about what happens when the landscape itself changes. We're talking about lost coastlines, lost settlements, lost knowledge, lost memory, and perhaps, in some cases, lost civilizations. That is why these underwater sites matter so much, because they are not just ruins. They are messages, messages from a world that was once alive, active, and human. A world that stood where the ocean now moves. A world that may still have more to tell us. If we keep looking, if we keep diving, if we keep asking what history left behind. The forgotten past is not always buried in sand. Sometimes it is sleeping beneath the sea. And every new sonar scan, every dive, and every submerged wall brings us one step closer to a past that was never truly gone. It was only hidden. If you want to keep uncovering the truths they left behind, subscribe, because the next discovery may already be waiting under the waves.